The telegram arrived in Dresden on a cold February morning in 1973. Dr. Heinrich Vormann read it twice, then a third time, his coffee growing cold on the oak desk that had belonged to his father. The message was brief, almost cryptic, but its implications sent a tremor through his chest. Moscow was requesting his expertise, not in the Soviet Union, but in a place he had only seen in grainy newsreels. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Vormann was 53 years old, a man whose entire career had been defined by metal, thrust, and the mathematics of flight. He had spent the war years as a young engineer at Messerschmitt, watching the Me-262 take shape under his calculations. After Germany's defeat, while his colleagues fled west to work for the Americans under Operation Paperclip, Vormann had remained in the Soviet sector. It had not been entirely his choice. His father's membership in the Communist Party had made him politically reliable in the eyes of the new masters. And so Heinrich Vormann had built his career in the German Democratic Republic, teaching aeronautical engineering at the Technical University of Dresden and consulting for the Ministry of Defense on matters he was forbidden to discuss. Now, at the twilight of his professional life, he was being summoned to examine the wreckage of American bombers. Not just any bombers. The B-52 Stratofortress, the aircraft that had terrorized Hanoi during what the Americans called Operation Linebacker II and what the Vietnamese simply called the Christmas bombings. He set down the telegram and walked to his window. The spires of Dresden rose against the grey winter sky, rebuilt from the ashes of 1945. He remembered the firestorm, the way the city had burned like paper. He remembered the American bombers then too, the B-17 flying fortresses that had reduced his childhood home to rubble. And now he was being asked to study their descendants. The irony was not lost on him. 3 weeks later, Vormann stepped off a Soviet Ilyushin Il-18 at Neubai Airport, north of Hanoi. The humidity struck him like a physical force, a wall of wet heat that made his German wool suit feel like a prison. Beside him stood 2 colleagues, Dr. Klaus Brenner, a specialist in jet propulsion from the Junkers research facility in Dessau, and Dr. Werner Hoffmann, an expert in radar and avionics from the Military Technical Institute in Berlin. Together, they formed a team of 3 East German scientists dispatched at Soviet request to analyze what remained of America's most fearsome weapon. A young Vietnamese officer met them on the tarmac. His name was Major Nguyen Van Tuan, and his English was precise, though accented. He shook their hands with formal courtesy and led them to a waiting vehicle, an old Soviet GZ-69 that rattled over pockmarked roads as they drove toward the capital. The landscape outside the window told the story of the war more eloquently than any briefing could. Vormann saw craters everywhere, vast circular wounds in the earth that had been partially filled with rainwater. He saw the skeletal remains of bridges, their spans twisted into abstract sculptures of destruction. He saw villages where only the foundations remained, and he saw children playing among the ruins as if they had known no other world. Major Tuan noticed his gaze. 12 days, he said quietly. That is how long the Christmas bombings lasted. 12 days and 12 nights. The Americans sent more than 700 B-52 sorties against our cities. They dropped over 15,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong alone. Vormann nodded slowly. He had read the reports in Dresden, clinical summaries of tonnage and sortie counts, but seeing the aftermath was something else entirely. The numbers became real here. They became craters and corpses and children who flinched at the sound of aircraft. "And yet you shot them down," he said. Major Tuan allowed himself a small smile. "We shot down 15 B-52s during Linebacker II, perhaps more. The Americans do not always acknowledge their losses." He paused, then added, "That is why you are here, Dr. Vormann, to tell us what we accomplished and to help us understand what we faced." The vehicle turned onto a wider road, heading toward the city center. In the distance, Vormann could see the outline of Hanoi, a jumble of colonial architecture and socialist apartment blocks, all of it scarred by war, but still standing. The Vietnamese had not surrendered. Despite everything the Americans had thrown at them, they had not surrendered. It was, Vormann thought, a remarkable thing, and as a German who had watched his own country brought to its knees by strategic bombing, he found himself wondering what secrets these fallen giants might reveal. What had made them so powerful, and what had ultimately made them vulnerable? The answers, he suspected, lay somewhere in the wreckage. Their first destination was not a laboratory or a military facility, but a lake. Hu Tiep Lake, in the Ba Dinh district of Hanoi, had become an unlikely monument to the air war. Major Tuan explained the significance as they walked along the narrow streets that surrounded it. On the night of December 27, 1972, one of your targets was hit by missiles from our 72nd Battalion, he said. The aircraft, a B-52G, was struck while flying over the city. It broke apart in mid-air, and the rear section fell here into this lake. Vormann stood at the water's edge and looked at what remained. The wreckage rose from the murky water like the bones of some prehistoric creature. He could see the massive landing gear still attached to a twisted section of fuselage. The metal was scorched and bent, but unmistakably American. Even in destruction, it spoke of industrial might beyond anything the GDR could produce. Dr. Brenner crouched beside him, examining the exposed structure. "Look at the thickness of the aluminum skin," he murmured in German, "and the riveting pattern. This is not ordinary construction. The Americans have developed manufacturing techniques we have only theorized about." Dr. Hoffman was more interested in the electronics. He pointed to a tangle of wires protruding from the wreckage. "Somewhere in there are the remains of their electronic countermeasures system. If we can recover even fragments, we might learn how they were jamming our radar." Major Tuan listened to their conversation without comment. His English was good enough to follow, but he waited until they had finished before speaking. "The lake wreckage is preserved as a memorial," he said, "but we have recovered substantial material from other crash sites, material that is now waiting for your analysis." He gestured toward the vehicle. "Come, I will take you to the warehouse." The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, in an area that had once been industrial before the bombs had flattened most of the factories. It was a long, low building with corrugated metal walls, guarded by soldiers who saluted Major Tuan with rigid formality. Inside, the three German scientists stopped and stared. The space was vast, perhaps 200 meters long and 50 meters wide, and every square meter was filled with wreckage, engines, wing sections, cockpit fragments, landing gear assemblies, tail sections with faded American insignia still visible beneath the soot. It was a graveyard of technology, a cathedral of destruction, and it represented the accumulated debris of years of air warfare over North Vietnam. Vormann walked slowly down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He passed a section of wing that still bore the distinctive swept shape of the B-52's design. He paused beside an engine nacelle, 8 massive cylinders arranged in a radial pattern around a central shaft. He stopped entirely when he reached the cockpit section. It was remarkably intact, considering what had happened to the aircraft that housed it. The ejection seats were gone, presumably with their occupants, but the instrument panels remained. Rows of dials and switches stretched across the console, their glass faces cracked but still readable. Vormann leaned closer, trying to decipher the labels: altitude, airspeed, fuel flow, engine temperature, the basic instruments of flight, familiar to any pilot. But there were other panels too, panels marked with acronyms he did not recognize: ECM, RAW, ILT-22. These were the electronic warfare systems, the devices that had allowed American bombers to penetrate North Vietnamese airspace despite one of the densest air defense networks in history. "How many aircraft does this represent?" he asked Major Tuan. The Vietnamese officer consulted a clipboard. "The material here comes from 11 B-52s, shot down over the north between 1972 and 1973. We also have fragments from F-4 Phantoms, F-105 Thunder Chiefs and other tactical aircraft, but the bombers are our priority." 11 B-52s. Vorman did a quick mental calculation. Each aircraft cost the Americans approximately $8 million. Each carried a crew of 6. Each could deliver up to 70,000 pounds of ordnance per mission. 11 aircraft meant $88 million in destroyed hardware, 66 crew members killed or captured, and nearly 800,000 pounds of bombs that never reached their targets. And yet the Americans had continued to fly them. Night after night, wave after wave, they had sent their bombers into the teeth of the Vietnamese defenses. The losses were acceptable to them. The strategic calculus demanded it. What kind of industrial capacity produced such disposable machines? What kind of society absorbed such losses without flinching? These were the questions that haunted Vorman as he began his work. They were questions that had no easy answers. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week, we bring you stories that reveal the hidden truths of history, the moments that shaped the world but were never told in textbooks. If you want to understand how power really works, subscribe now and join the journey. The systematic examination began the following morning. Major Tuan had arranged for the German team to work in a corner of the warehouse that had been cleared and equipped with tables, lights, and basic tools. A team of Vietnamese technicians stood ready to assist. Young men and women who had been trained in Soviet technical schools and who approached the American wreckage with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed hostility. Vorman understood their feelings. These machines had killed their families, destroyed their cities, and terrorized their nights. And now they were expected to help foreign scientists study them with clinical detachment. It was a difficult thing to ask. He began with the airframe. The B-52 was, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement of aeronautical engineering. Its wingspan exceeded 56 meters, longer than the distance of the Wright brothers' first flight. Its fuselage stretched nearly 50 meters from nose to tail. Empty, it weighed over 80,000 kilograms. Fully loaded, it could exceed 200,000 kilograms, making it one of the heaviest aircraft ever to achieve sustained flight. The design philosophy was apparent even in the wreckage. Every structural element had been optimized for one purpose: to carry the maximum possible payload over the maximum possible distance. The wing construction used a sophisticated multi-spar design that distributed loads across the entire structure, allowing the aircraft to withstand the stresses of turbulence, combat maneuvering, and the tremendous weight of its bomb load. Dr. Brenner spent 3 days examining the engine components. The B-52 used 8 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines, arranged in 4 paired nacelles beneath the wings. Each engine produced approximately 6,000 kilograms of thrust, for a total of nearly 50,000 kilograms when all 8 were running at full power. "The metallurgy is remarkable," Brenner reported during their evening debrief. "The turbine blades are made of a nickel-based superalloy that can withstand temperatures exceeding 900 degrees Celsius. We have nothing comparable in East Germany. The Soviets are perhaps 10 years behind this level of development." Vorman nodded. He had suspected as much. The Americans had poured billions of dollars into jet engine research since the end of World War II, building on German foundations but advancing far beyond what any European nation could achieve. The J-57 represented the state-of-the-art in 1950s propulsion technology, and even 2 decades later, it remained formidable. But the engines were not what most interested Vorman. His attention was drawn to the electronics, the systems that Dr. Hoffman had been studying with increasing amazement. "You need to see this," Hoffman said on the fourth day, leading Vormann to a table covered with circuit boards and wiring harnesses. "I have been able to identify components from the AN/ALT-28 electronic countermeasures system. It is beyond anything I expected." He picked up a small module, perhaps 15 centimeters square, and turned it over in his hands. "This single unit contains more transistors than our entire radar laboratory. It can detect incoming radar signals across multiple frequency bands, analyze their characteristics, and generate jamming responses in milliseconds. The computing power required for this is enormous." Vormann examined the module. It was beautifully constructed, each component precisely placed, each solder joint clean and uniform. This was not hand-built equipment. This was mass production at a level of quality that European factories could not match. "How does it work?" he asked. Hoffman shook his head slowly. "I am still trying to understand, but the basic principle is clear. The system monitors the electromagnetic environment around the aircraft. When it detects a threat, such as the guidance radar of an SA-2 missile, it broadcasts a signal designed to confuse the radar's tracking system. The missile guidance receives false information about the bomber's position. Instead of hitting the aircraft, it detonates in empty air. And yet they shot down 15 bombers," Vormann said. "Yes, and that is the fascinating part." Hoffman set down the module and pulled out a notebook filled with diagrams. "Our Vietnamese colleagues have provided extensive data on the engagements. They describe their tactics in detail, and what emerges is a picture of adaptive warfare, of countermeasures and countermeasures, of electronic chess played at the speed of light." He flipped through his notes. "The Americans believed their jamming systems were invulnerable, but the Vietnamese, with Soviet help, discovered weaknesses. They learned to coordinate multiple missile batteries, to fire salvos from different angles, to overwhelm the jamming capacity of individual aircraft. They learned to predict the bombers' flight paths, which the Americans foolishly kept constant night after night. They learned to use the bombers' own radar emissions to track them." Vormann listened carefully. This was the essence of modern air warfare. Not just machines against machines, but minds against minds. The Vietnamese had faced the most technologically advanced air force in history, and they had found ways to hurt it. Not to defeat it entirely, but to exact a price that made victory unbearable. "The jamming worked most of the time," Hoffman continued. "Perhaps 90% of the missiles fired at B-52s missed their targets, but the Vietnamese fired hundreds of missiles, and 90% effectiveness means 10% of those missiles found their mark. At the scale of Linebacker 2, 10% was enough. It was a sobering analysis. The Americans had built machines that were nearly invulnerable, yet not quite invulnerable enough. They had created electronic countermeasures that could defeat most threats, yet not all threats. And in the mathematics of attrition warfare, almost was not good enough. The next phase of analysis focused on the weapons systems. The B-52 had been designed as a nuclear bomber, intended to deliver thermonuclear warheads to targets deep inside the Soviet Union. But in Vietnam, it had been converted to a conventional bombing platform, its massive bomb bay filled with iron bombs that fell on jungle and village alike. The bomb racks recovered from the wreckage told their own story. Each B-52D variant could carry up to 84 500-pound bombs internally, plus 24 more on external pylons. A single aircraft could devastate an area the size of several football fields in a single pass. A formation of 3 aircraft, the standard cell used in arc light missions, could create a carpet of destruction nearly 2 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide. Vormann stood beside a recovered bomb rack, running his fingers over the release mechanisms. Each bomb was held by a pair of hooks that opened simultaneously when the bombardier pressed his release button. The system was simple, reliable, and brutally effective. There was no precision guidance, no smart munitions, no attempt to discriminate between military and civilian targets. The B-52 was an area weapon designed to destroy everything within its kill radius, and it had done so repeatedly for years. Major Tuan appeared beside him, following his gaze. "You are thinking about what these bombs did," he said quietly. Foreman nodded. "I am thinking about Dresden." The Vietnamese officer was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Your city was also destroyed by American bombers, you understand." "I understand the mathematics," Foreman replied. "I understand the industrial logic. But understanding does not mean acceptance." He turned away from the bomb rack and walked toward a different section of the warehouse where the navigation equipment had been laid out. This was the technology that allowed B-52s to find their targets in darkness, through clouds, across thousands of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain. The primary navigation system was the AN/ASQ-48 bombing and navigation computer, a massive analog device that filled an entire equipment bay in the aircraft's belly. It processed inputs from multiple sources: radar altimeters, Doppler navigation systems, stellar trackers, and inertial measurement units. It calculated the aircraft's position to within a few hundred meters, good enough for area bombing, but not for precision strikes. Dr. Hoffman had already disassembled several components of the system. "The precision is impressive for its era," he explained, "but the system has significant limitations. It requires extensive calibration before each mission. It drifts over time, accumulating errors that can reach kilometers on long flights. And it provides no real-time feedback to the crew about their actual position relative to the target." "So how did they hit anything?" Foreman asked. "They used radar bombing techniques. The AN/APQ-126 terrain-following radar provides a ground map that the bombardier can match against target photographs. When the radar image aligns with the expected target pattern, he releases the bombs." "And if the radar is jammed?" Hoffman shrugged. "Then he relies on dead reckoning. He calculates the expected release point based on airspeed, altitude, and wind conditions, and hopes for the best." It was not a reassuring picture of precision warfare. The B-52 was accurate enough to destroy factories and rail yards, but not accurate enough to avoid hospitals and schools. Every mission was a gamble, a calculation of acceptable civilian casualties balanced against military necessity. Foreman thought of the children he had seen playing among the craters. He thought of his own childhood, running through the burning streets of Dresden while the bombers droned overhead. The technology had evolved, but the fundamental nature of strategic bombing had not changed. It remained a blunt instrument, a terror weapon disguised in the language of military necessity, and yet the Americans continued to refine it, to improve it, to make it ever more efficient at the business of destruction. The evidence of that refinement surrounded him in the warehouse, a testament to human ingenuity in the service of human suffering. By the end of the second week, the German team had catalogued over 3,000 individual components from the B-52 wreckage. Each item had been photographed, measured, and described in technical reports that would eventually find their way to Moscow and East Berlin. The work was exhausting, but intellectually compelling, a puzzle whose pieces revealed more about American industrial capacity than any intelligence briefing could convey. What struck Foreman most powerfully was not any single technology, but the integration of systems. The B-52 was not merely a collection of advanced components. It was a system of systems, each element designed to work seamlessly with the others, each function supported by redundant backups, each capability enhanced by synergistic interaction. The engines provided thrust, but they also powered the generators that supplied electricity to the avionics. The avionics provided navigation, but they also supported the electronic countermeasures that protected the aircraft from missiles. The countermeasures required precise timing, which depended on the navigation computer's accurate position fixes. And all of these systems were monitored by a crew of 6 specialists, each responsible for a specific domain, each trained to diagnose and respond to failures in flight. This level of integration required not just engineering skill, but organizational capacity. It required factories that could produce components to exacting tolerances. It required supply chains that could deliver materials from across the globe. It required training programs that could transform young men into technical specialists capable of operating systems their fathers could not have imagined. It required maintenance facilities that could service complex machinery in the field, keeping aircraft flying mission after mission. The B-52 was, in short, the product of an industrial civilization at the height of its power. And that civilization could produce them in numbers that defied comprehension. Vormann had obtained a briefing document from Major Tuan that listed American aircraft production figures. The numbers were staggering. Boeing had built 744 B-52s between 1952 and 1962. At the peak of production, the factory in Wichita, Kansas, had delivered 1 aircraft every 3 days. The total program cost exceeded $11 billion, an expenditure that equaled the entire annual gross domestic product of many nations. And the B-52 was just one aircraft type. The Americans had simultaneously produced thousands of fighters, hundreds of transport aircraft, and fleets of helicopters. Their military-industrial complex operated on a scale that made the Soviet Union's vaunted production capacity seem modest by comparison. This was the reality that Vormann confronted in the warehouse. The wreckage before him represented a tiny fraction of American air power, a statistical blip in the vast ocean of machines that the United States could deploy. The Vietnamese had shot down 15 B-52s during Linebacker II. The Americans had more than 200 available in theater. They could absorb the losses and continue operations indefinitely. The mathematical implications were sobering. If the Vietnamese shot down 1 bomber for every 20 sorties, they would need to destroy 60 aircraft to halt a 1,000-sortie campaign. If each aircraft cost 6 crew members, that meant 360 American airmen killed or captured. But the Americans had proven during World War II that they could sustain losses of that magnitude without breaking. They had lost thousands of bombers over Germany, and they had kept coming until the Reich was rubble. The Vietnamese understood this calculus. Their strategy had never been to defeat American air power in the sky. It had been to make the political cost of the air war unbearable. Every downed bomber was a story on American television. Every captured pilot was a negotiating chip. Every bomb that fell on Hanoi was a propaganda victory, evidence of American brutality that turned world opinion against the war. In the end, that strategy had worked. Not because the Vietnamese had destroyed American air power, but because they had outlasted American will. The bombers had returned to their bases. The troops had come home. The war had ended, not with a decisive military victory, but with a negotiated settlement that left Vietnam unified under communist rule. Vormann was thinking about these matters when Major Tuan approached him with an unexpected request. "There is something I would like you to see," the Vietnamese officer said. "Something that is not in the warehouse." He led the German scientist to a waiting vehicle, and they drove through the streets of Hanoi as the afternoon light faded into tropical twilight. The city was coming alive around them, street vendors setting up their stalls, children returning from school, workers heading home on bicycles that seemed to outnumber the automobiles 100 to 1. They stopped at a hospital on the outskirts of the city. It was a plain building, functional rather than elegant, with peeling paint and windows that did not quite close. Major Tuan led Vorman inside, through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and something else, something organic and distressing. The burn ward was on the third floor. Vorman had seen burn victims before, in Dresden after the firestorm, but he was not prepared for what he encountered here. The patients were mostly young, many of them children. Their injuries were horrific. Flesh melted and fused, limbs contracted into permanent disfigurement. They lay in their beds without speaking, their eyes following the foreign visitor with expressions that held neither hope nor hatred, only endurance. "Napalm," Major Tuan said simply. "The Americans dropped millions of gallons on our country. The B-52s did not carry it, but the tactical aircraft that supported them did. These are the survivors. The ones who did not survive, you cannot see." Foreman stood in silence, unable to find words. He thought of the bomb racks in the warehouse, the elegant mechanisms designed to release their cargo with clockwork precision. He thought of the transistors and turbine blades, the marvels of engineering that had made this destruction possible. And he thought of the gap between technical achievement and moral consequence, the chasm that separated what humans could build from what humans should build. Major Tuan watched him carefully. "I did not bring you here to make you feel guilty," he said. "You did not drop these bombs. Your country did not fight this war. But I wanted you to understand what you are studying. These machines are not abstractions. They have effects in the world, effects that remain long after the machines themselves are destroyed." Vorman nodded slowly. He had always known this, intellectually. But knowing and understanding were different things. Understanding came through the eyes of the children in the burn ward, through the silence of their suffering, through the weight of their endurance. "I understand," he said quietly. They left the hospital as darkness fell over Hanoi. The city was quiet now, the streets empty except for the occasional military vehicle. Somewhere in the distance, Vorman could hear the drone of aircraft engines. American reconnaissance planes, perhaps, still flying over Vietnamese airspace despite the ceasefire. Or perhaps just commercial flights, resuming the normal traffic that war had interrupted. He returned to the warehouse the next morning with renewed determination. If he was going to study these machines, he would study them completely. He would understand not just their technology, but their place in the larger system of industrial warfare. He would document everything, not for the benefit of Soviet military planners, but for history, so that future generations would know what had been built and what it had cost. If this story is touching your heart, if you feel the weight of these moments as I tell them, then leave a comment right now with these words. "History should never be forgotten." Write this phrase and show me that you understand why these stories matter. Your comment helps more people discover these hidden truths. The breakthrough came in the third week when Dr. Hoffman finally succeeded in reconstructing a functional segment of the B-52's electronic countermeasure system. Working from components salvaged from multiple crash sites, he had assembled a partial NALQ-117 radar deception system on a test bench in the warehouse. "Watch this," he said, activating the system with a jury-rigged power supply. A bank of oscilloscopes flickered to life, displaying waveforms that meant nothing to the untrained eye, but everything to an electronics specialist. "This is a simulation of what the system does when it detects an SA-2's fan song radar." The waveforms shifted, modulated, transformed. Hoffman pointed to the display. "The system analyzes the incoming radar signal, identifies its frequency and pulse characteristics, and generates a deception response. It creates false echoes that appear on the missile guidance radar as additional targets. The radar operator sees multiple aircraft where only one exists. He cannot determine which target is real." Vorman leaned closer. "And the missile? The missile follows whichever signal is strongest. If the deception works, it follows a false echo and detonates harmlessly. If the deception fails, it follows the real echo and hits the aircraft. What determines whether it works?" Hoffman was quiet for a moment. Many factors: the strength of the original radar signal, the quality of the jamming equipment, the skill of the radar operator, the angle of approach, the weather conditions. It is a complex interaction with many variables. He paused, then added, "But the most important factor is something the Americans did not anticipate. They designed their countermeasures to defeat individual radar systems operating independently. They did not account for coordinated attacks from multiple batteries." This was the key insight that had emerged from the Vietnamese tactical reports. The SA-2 system, as designed by the Soviets, operated as isolated batteries that tracked and engaged targets independently. The Americans had developed countermeasures that could defeat this approach, but the Vietnamese, working with Soviet advisors, had learned to coordinate their batteries. Multiple radars would track the same target from different angles. Multiple missiles would be launched in salvos, arriving at the predicted intercept point simultaneously. The jamming systems could deceive one radar, perhaps two, but not 4 or 5 at once. This coordination required communication, training, and disciplined execution. It required the kind of military professionalism that the Americans had assumed their Vietnamese opponents lacked. The assumption had cost them 15 bombers in 12 days. Foreman found himself admiring the Vietnamese achievement. They had faced the most technologically sophisticated air force in history, and they had found its weakness. Not through superior technology, but through superior tactics. They had turned the Americans' own complexity against them, exploiting the gaps between systems that were designed to operate independently. It was a lesson with implications far beyond Vietnam. Modern warfare was becoming increasingly dependent on electronic systems. The side that understood these systems better, that could find their weaknesses and exploit them, would have an advantage that no amount of industrial production could overcome. But there was another lesson too. The Americans had learned from their losses. By the end of Linebacker the Secu, they had changed their tactics, varying their approach routes, coordinating their jamming more effectively, striking at Vietnamese radar installations with specialized Wild Weasel aircraft. The loss rate had dropped. The Vietnamese had adapted, and then the Americans had adapted in turn. It was an endless cycle of measure and countermeasure, a technological arms race that would continue as long as the war lasted. Dr. Brenner had reached similar conclusions in his analysis of the propulsion systems. "The Americans are not standing still," he reported during their evening session. "I have examined engine components from aircraft shot down at different times, and I can see the evolution. Later, engines have improved turbine blade alloys, more efficient compressor designs, better fuel injection systems. Each generation is incrementally better than the last." He spread a series of photographs across the table. "Look at these fuel nozzles. The early ones are simple atomizers, designed for robust reliability. The later ones are precision instruments, optimized for specific fuel-air mixtures across different flight regimes. The performance improvement is perhaps 5%, but 5% compounded over decades becomes a significant advantage." Vorman nodded. This was the nature of industrial competition. Small improvements accumulated over time, each one building on the last, until the cumulative effect transformed the entire field. The Americans had been pursuing this approach for 30 years, since the end of World War II. They had created institutions dedicated to incremental improvement, research laboratories, test facilities, academic programs, industrial partnerships. The result was a technological momentum that neither the Soviets nor anyone else could easily match. The implications for the German Democratic Republic were troubling. East Germany prided itself on technical excellence, on the quality of its engineers, and the rigor of its educational system. But excellence was not enough. The Americans had excellence too, plus resources on a scale that made East German efforts seem trivial. They could afford to experiment, to fail, to try again. They could pursue multiple approaches simultaneously and select the best. They could attract talent from around the world with promises of funding and freedom. These were advantages that no amount of central planning could replicate. The Soviet model of industrial organization had achieved remarkable things, but it was reaching its limits. Foreman could see this clearly now, in the contrast between the wreckage before him and the products of East German factories. The gap was not just technical, it was systemic. The final week of analysis brought additional revelations. The Vietnamese had provided access to documents captured from downed aircraft, flight manuals, navigation charts, maintenance logs, even personal letters from crew members. These materials offered a window into the human side of the air war, the experiences of the men who flew the bombers and the culture that produced them. The flight manuals were comprehensive, detailed, and surprisingly candid about the aircraft's limitations. They discussed the circumstances under which systems might fail, the procedures for handling emergencies, the expected crew responses to various threat scenarios. They assumed a high level of technical literacy among the readers, but also a practical understanding of combat conditions. What struck Vorman most was the tone. The manuals were neither heroic nor apologetic. They treated the B-52 as a tool, an instrument for accomplishing specific tasks. The tasks themselves were described matter-of-factly: ingress routes, weapon release parameters, egress procedures. There was no discussion of the moral implications, no acknowledgement of what the bombs would do when they reached their targets. The crew's job was to deliver ordnance to specified coordinates. What happened afterward was someone else's responsibility. This compartmentalization of function was characteristic of modern industrial warfare. Each participant performed a specialized role, contributing to an outcome that no single individual could claim responsibility for. The pilot flew the aircraft. The navigator calculated the route. The bombardier released the weapons. The maintenance crews kept the systems operational. The planners selected the targets. The politicians authorized the missions. No one person decided to burn children with napalm. The decision emerged from a process distributed across thousands of actors, each performing their assigned function with professional competence. It was a system designed to diffuse moral responsibility, to transform the act of killing into a series of technical operations that could be performed without emotional engagement. And it worked. The American crews flew their missions night after night, month after month, year after year. They followed their procedures, met their objectives, and returned to their bases. Some of them were troubled by what they did. Some of them refused to fly, but most of them continued because the system expected it of them, and the system was more powerful than any individual conscience. Foreman recognized this pattern. He had seen it before in Germany during the war that had shaped his youth. The same compartmentalization, the same diffusion of responsibility, the same subordination of individual morality to collective function. It was not uniquely American. It was a feature of industrial civilization itself, the dark side of the efficiency that made modern life possible. The letters were different. They were personal, intimate, human. They spoke of families waiting at home, of hopes for the future, of fears that could not be expressed in official channels. One letter, written by a young lieutenant to his wife, described the moment of bomb release in terms that haunted Vorman long after he finished reading. The bombs fall away from the aircraft, and for a moment you feel lighter, as if a burden has been lifted. Then you remember what they are going to do, and the burden returns heavier than before. I try not to think about it. We all try not to think about it. But sometimes at night, the thoughts come anyway. The lieutenant had not survived his tour. His aircraft had been shot down over Hanoi on Christmas Eve 1972. His body had never been recovered. The formal report was completed on the last day of March 1973. It ran to over 300 pages, filled with technical specifications, performance analyses, and strategic assessments. Vormann had written the summary section himself, trying to capture in words what the wreckage had revealed about American power and Vietnamese resistance. The conclusions were complex. The B-52 was, by any technical measure, an extraordinary weapon system. Its range, payload capacity, and survivability exceeded anything in the Soviet or Chinese inventory. Its electronic countermeasures represented the cutting edge of defensive technology. Its maintenance systems allowed sustained operations at a tempo that would exhaust less sophisticated forces. But the B-52 was also a product of its era, designed for a kind of warfare that was becoming obsolete even as it was being employed. Strategic bombing, the concept that had guided its development, assumed that destroying an enemy's industrial capacity would force surrender. This assumption had been disproven in Vietnam, where the target was not industrial capacity but political will, and where the bombing had strengthened rather than weakened the enemy's resolve. The Americans had won every engagement but lost the war. Their technology had performed as designed, but their strategy had been fundamentally flawed. They had assumed that superior firepower would translate into victory, that the mathematics of destruction would overwhelm the calculus of resistance. They had been wrong. This was the lesson that Vormann emphasized in his summary. Technology was a tool, not a solution. It could multiply the effects of sound strategy, but it could not compensate for strategic error. The Vietnamese had understood this. The Americans had not. But there was another lesson, too, one that Vormann included in a classified annex that would be read only by senior officials in Moscow and East Berlin. The American industrial capacity revealed in the wreckage was not static. It was dynamic, adaptive, constantly improving. The B-52s shot down over Hanoi in 1972 were significantly more capable than the B-52s that had entered service in 1955. And the Americans were already developing new systems, stealth aircraft and precision munitions that would make the current generation of weapons obsolete. The Soviet Union and its allies could not afford to fall behind. They needed to invest in their own research and development, to pursue their own technological evolution, to maintain rough parity with American capabilities. The alternative was to face a growing gap that would eventually become insurmountable. This was not a comforting conclusion. It implied an endless competition, an arms race that would consume resources desperately needed for civilian development. It implied that the Cold War would continue indefinitely, with each side pursuing technological advantages that the other would match or counter. It implied that the wreckage in the warehouse was not the end of anything, but rather a moment in an ongoing struggle that neither side could afford to lose. The report was transmitted to Moscow in early April. Vormann never learned what happened to it afterward. He assumed it was read, analyzed, filed, and eventually forgotten, one more document in the vast bureaucratic archives of the Soviet military establishment. The insights it contained might have influenced some decisions, somewhere, or they might have been ignored entirely. There was no way to know. What Vormann did know was that his own understanding had been transformed by the experience. He had arrived in Hanoi as a technical specialist, interested primarily in engineering questions. He was leaving as something more complex, a man who had glimpsed the intersection of technology and humanity, of industrial capacity and moral consequence. The Vietnamese drove him to the airport on a morning that was already hot and humid, the tropical sun burning through the haze that hung over the city. Major Tuan accompanied him, the same formal courtesy that had marked their first meeting now tinged with something warmer, something approaching friendship. "What will you tell them when you return?" the Vietnamese officer asked as they waited for the boarding call. Vormann considered the question carefully. "I will tell them what I found," he said finally. "I will describe the technology, analyze the systems, assess the capabilities. That is my job." "And what about the rest? The hospital? The children?" Foreman was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I will remember. That is all I can promise. I will remember what I saw, and I will carry it with me. Perhaps someday it will matter." Major Tuan nodded slowly. "Perhaps someday it will," he agreed. The aircraft was boarding now, passengers filing toward the gate with their bags and bundles. Vorman shook hands with the Vietnamese officer one last time, then turned and walked toward the plane. He did not look back. The flight to Moscow took several hours, crossing the vast expanse of China and the Soviet Far East. Vorman spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape scroll beneath him. Mountains and rivers, cities and farms, the endless variation of human settlement spread across the earth. From this altitude, it all looked peaceful. You could not see the bomb craters from here. You could not see the burned children. You could see only the abstract patterns of geography, the shapes that maps depicted, the territories that nations fought over. It was a God's-eye view, detached and comprehensive. The view that bombardiers saw when they released their weapons. He understood now why they could do it. From here, the targets were not human. They were coordinates, patterns, abstractions. The moral weight of destruction was invisible at 30,000 feet. It became visible only when you descended, when you walked among the wreckage, when you met the survivors and heard their stories. But you could not stay on the ground forever. Eventually, you had to rise again, to return to the abstract view, to the strategic perspective that made decisions possible. That was the nature of modern warfare, the price of industrial civilization. You had to be able to see clearly from above, even if seeing clearly from below was unbearable. The aircraft began its descent toward Moscow. Vorman gathered his papers, organized his thoughts, prepared himself for the debriefings that awaited. He was a technical specialist returning from a successful mission. He had done his job. He had analyzed the wreckage, assessed the capabilities, drawn the appropriate conclusions. But he had also seen the hospital, and he would never forget it. That was something the reports could not capture, something that transcended technical analysis. It was the human truth beneath the industrial logic, the suffering that statistics concealed. He carried it with him as he stepped off the aircraft into the Moscow cold. He would carry it for the rest of his life. The years that followed were kind to Heinrich Vorman, at least by the standards of the German Democratic Republic. He returned to his teaching position in Dresden, resumed his consultations with the Ministry of Defense, and gradually became recognized as one of the leading aerospace authorities in the Eastern Bloc. His Vietnam report circulated among Soviet military planners, influencing decisions about electronic warfare development and air defense doctrine. But Vorman himself had changed in ways that were not visible on his curriculum vitae. He had seen something in Hanoi that could not be unseen, understood something that could not be ununderstood. The wreckage of the B-52s had shown him the full magnitude of American industrial power, but the hospital had shown him the full consequence of that power's application. He lived now with both visions, the technical and the human, and the tension between them shaped everything he did. In 1975, he watched on television as Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. The war that had brought him to Hanoi was finally over, ended not by superior technology, but by political exhaustion. The Americans had withdrawn their troops, reduced their support, and eventually abandoned their allies to their fate. The most powerful nation on earth had been defeated, not by military force but by moral attrition. Vorman wondered what the American airmen were thinking as they watched the same images. The men who had flown the B-52s, who had released their bombs into the darkness over Hanoi, who had believed they were fighting for freedom and democracy. Did they understand now what they had accomplished? Did they recognize the gap between their intentions and their effects? He suspected some of them did. The letters he had read in Vietnam, suggested that many American servicemen were troubled by their role in the war, that they carried their own burdens of guilt and doubt. They were not monsters. They were ordinary men caught up in an extraordinary system, performing their assigned functions with professional competence while trying not to think too deeply about the consequences. This was the true horror of modern warfare. It was not malice that drove the destruction, but indifference. The system was designed to produce results, and it produced them with remarkable efficiency. The human cost was an externality, a side effect that could be minimized or ignored but never eliminated entirely. The bombs fell, the children burned, and the wheels of industry continued to turn. In 1989, Foreman stood in the streets of Dresden as the Berlin Wall fell. He was 70 years old, a man who had lived through 2 German states and now witnessed the collapse of the second. The crowds around him were celebrating, embracing strangers, weeping with joy. The Cold War was ending, the division that had shaped his entire adult life was dissolving, and a new world was being born. But Vorman did not feel joy. He felt something more complicated, a mixture of relief and apprehension, and profound uncertainty. The system that had sustained him was collapsing. The institutions that had given his life meaning were being swept away. He had devoted himself to building East German aerospace capability, to maintaining the technical balance between East and West. Now that balance was obsolete, the competition that had justified his work was ending, and he was left to wonder what it had all been for. He thought of the B-52s again, of the wreckage in the warehouse, of the children in the hospital. He thought of the endless arms race, the billions spent on weapons that were designed never to be used, the resources that could have fed the hungry and healed the sick, instead of building machines of destruction. Had any of it been necessary? Had the Cold War been inevitable? Or had it been a collective failure of imagination? A tragedy that could have been avoided if different choices had been made. There were no easy answers. History did not offer easy answers. It offered only questions and the obligation to keep asking them. Vorman died in Dresden in 1997 at the age of 78. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his contributions to East German aerospace development, his teaching career at the Technical University, his numerous publications in scientific journals. It did not mention Vietnam, but his private papers, discovered after his death, told a different story. Among his personal effects was a small photograph, worn and faded, showing a group of children in a hospital ward. On the back, in Vorman's careful handwriting, was a single sentence: "Remember what this cost." His granddaughter, who inherited the papers, did not understand the reference. She had never heard of her grandfather's trip to Vietnam, never known about the B-52s or the burned children or the warehouse filled with wreckage. It was a chapter of history that had been closed, sealed away, forgotten, but the photograph remained. And when she looked at it, at the faces of the children and the date on the back, she felt something stir within her. A question that demanded an answer, a truth that refused to be buried. She began to research, to investigate, to piece together the story that her grandfather had never told. And slowly, fragment by fragment, the truth emerged. The German scientist who had studied American bombers in Vietnam, the wreckage that had revealed the magnitude of American power, the hospital that had revealed the magnitude of human suffering. It was a story about technology and morality, about industrial capacity and its consequences, about the gap between what we can build and what we should build. It was a story that resonated across decades, that connected the firebombing of Dresden to the Christmas bombings of Hanoi, to the precision strikes of the 21st century. The weapons changed, but the fundamental questions remained. What are we willing to do in the name of victory? What costs are we willing to impose on others to achieve our goals? And how do we live with the consequences of our choices when the smoke has cleared and the wreckage has been catalogued and the children in the hospital have grown up or died? These were the questions that Heinrich Vormann had carried with him from Hanoi. These were the questions that his granddaughter now carried in turn. And these were the questions that we must all carry, as long as we remain capable of building machines more powerful than our wisdom to use them. The B-52s still fly today, more than 70 years after the first one rolled off the assembly line in Wichita. They have been upgraded, modernized, equipped with precision munitions and digital navigation systems that would have seemed like science fiction to the crews who flew them over Vietnam. But they remain, fundamentally, the same aircraft that Heinrich Vormann studied in that warehouse in Hanoi, instruments of destruction on a scale that humbles the imagination. And somewhere in Dresden, in a box of old photographs, a small picture remains. Children in a hospital ward, burned by weapons that fell from the sky. A reminder of what was done, and what must never be forgotten. If you watch this far, it's because this story touched something inside you. It's because you understand that history is not just dates and battles, but human lives and human choices. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates stories that reveal the hidden truths of our world." If this video made you think, if it made you feel, then please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Every share helps more people discover these important narratives. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. We're building something here, a community of people who want to understand history deeply, who want to see beyond the headlines and the textbooks, who want to know what really happened and why it matters. Join us on this journey. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next video.